I was now 43 years old, and I spent every day sleeping alone. I will never forget that Tuesday night. When I went to bed that night, a heavy silence fell with a feeling of exhaustion surrounding me. The house was as peaceful as ever, but the peaceful silence did not last long. Not long after, I heard a soft knock on the door. I hesitantly opened my eyes and sat up. Something felt strange in the darkness of the room. "Adrian?" I called out. "Mom." My son's whisper echoed in the darkness. The door creaked softly and Adrian stepped inside. He looked shy. His pajamas were not those of a child, but of a young man, now 22 years old. The look on his face aroused a protective instinct in me, but I also felt uneasy. "I can't sleep," he finally said, looking at the floor. "Come here," I said, tapping the space next to me. He hesitated for a moment, then walked over and slid under the blankets. The bed creaked slightly, and now we were lying side by side, only a few inches apart. Adrian's warmth was immediately felt. I tried not to look at him, but out of the corner of my eye, it was impossible to see that he was no longer a child. He had become a young man with sharpened features and broadened shoulders. This realization embarrassed and confused me. Turning to face me, he murmured in a fragile voice, "Sometimes I feel so lonely in this house." I couldn't answer. Instead, I put my hand on his shoulder, and without hesitation, he turned toward me and hugged me tightly. The strength of his embrace surprised me. His arms were wrapped around me, his face close to my neck. I could feel her heartbeat and her warm breath. "Mom, sometimes it's so hard," she said in a low voice. "I'm here," I whispered. "I'm always here." But there was a restlessness inside me. My heart was racing. I couldn't understand why this heat was so overwhelming. "Thank you, Mom," Adrian murmured. His eyes were closed and his breathing finally slowed. He fell asleep, but I couldn't just lie there. A question was running through my head. What had happened tonight? The way Adrian hugged me was too intimate. What was even more disturbing was that I couldn't ignore it. In the morning, Adrian was still asleep. The first rays of the sun were shining on his face. He looked innocent, but inside everything was a mess. I put my head back on the pillow and took a deep breath. I needed to think. I needed to try to understand what had happened last night. But one thing was certain. This was not just one night. The sunlight slowly filled my room and woke me up. Thoughts of that night were still running through me. Adrian was still asleep. I carefully got out of bed and made my way to the kitchen. I needed some time. I needed to calm down before I woke Adrian. I knew I had to do something today. I struggled with my thoughts, trying to calm the restlessness that was building up inside me. I decided to make breakfast before Adrian woke up. I gathered the ingredients for the pancakes and started mixing them. After a few minutes, I noticed Adrian stirring. When I turned around, he was standing by the door. His eyes were still half closed. "Morning," he said, but there was something strange in his tone. It sounded both tired and careful. "Good morning, honey," I replied, trying not to look at her. I was trying to act normal as I flipped the pancakes, but I could feel Adrian's gaze on me, a different one than usual, watching my every move, paying attention to every little thing. The warmth of the kitchen surrounded me, and the uneasiness growing inside me wouldn't leave me. Adrian's eyes were on me as they had been the night before, but this morning they felt different, more intense. I realized that his eyes weren't just on me. He was studying me, scanning my body. For a while, I tried to ignore him, but no matter how hard I tried, I could feel him watching me. The uneasiness deepened inside me. My heart was racing, but I tried to stay calm, pretending that everything was fine. Adrian's demeanor was not his usual one. Usually he was more relaxed, more cheerful, but this morning there was a distance. It was as if he had drawn a boundary and was looking for courage in that boundary. His eyes looked at me as if he wanted to tell me something, but he didn't say it. I put the pancakes on a plate and handed it to him. "Here, enjoy," I said. The plate gripped his hands briefly. At that moment, his eyes met mine, and I felt something deep in his gaze. It was as if the restlessness inside me found a reflection in his eyes. Adrian sat at the table without a word. He didn't focus on breakfast. His eyes were always on me. I realized that his gaze followed me every time I moved, something we had never experienced before. A confusion was growing inside me, and even though I didn't understand what was happening, I felt that it had to be resolved. Adrian's gaze and behavior had a profound effect on me. As the smell of pancakes filled the kitchen, the tension inside me grew. I was fully aware of Adrian's eyes on me, but all I wanted to do was make breakfast and carry on with the day as normal. When night came, I was alone in my room, but this solitude was different from the others. Adrian's behavior was making me think. I tried to fall asleep, but something kept running through my mind. Suddenly, I heard a sound in the darkness of the room. I opened my eyes and saw a shadow in the darkness. Adrian had stepped into the room. He came in through the door, which was slightly open. My heart began to race. My son was in my room in the middle of the night. All my emotions were mixed up. It was something a mother never expects. Adrian's action at that moment made my heart beat wildly, as if it would suddenly burst out of its socket. I quickly stepped back and tried to stop him. "No, stop! This isn't right," I said, out of breath. My words were like a whisper in the air. Adrian took a few steps back. There was disappointment in his eyes, but his gaze wouldn't leave me. "Adrian, please. This isn't right," I said, my voice trembling, my body drenched in sweat. It was impossible to control the emotions inside me. As a mother, I had never imagined experiencing something like this. It felt both frightening and completely wrong for my son to approach me in this way. Adrian's gaze changed. It had an intensity I had never seen before. My heart felt like it was being crushed under those eyes. I struggled to pull myself back. For a moment, Adrian was silent. Then he came closer again and once more placed a kiss on my lips. I felt his hands from my shoulders to my waist, then down to my hips. Somewhere inside me, I knew I had to stop, but I couldn't move. That night passed somehow. When I woke up in the morning, Adrian wasn't there. I was alone in my bed, empty inside, and I took a deep breath and left the room. I tried to understand what had happened to Adrian, but it was hard to even pull myself together. As I left the house, my steps were heavy. There was a heaviness in my chest that I couldn't describe. The more I thought about what had happened, the more complicated everything became. Inside, I was fighting with my complicated feelings for Adrian, trying to understand what I was feeling, what I should do. Everything felt like a dream, but it was real. What was happening between Adrian and me? I couldn't make sense of it. I asked myself why I felt so bad. Was I still seeing him as a child, or was I fooling myself? I decided to suppress my feelings, to try to forget everything, to wipe it all away, but something was breaking inside me. Adrian was no longer a child, but that made me feel even more lost. All these questions swirled around in my head, but I couldn't find an answer to any of them. When I returned home that day, Adrian wasn't there. This made me feel both relieved and strangely empty. The loneliness made the intense silence even more unbearable as I tried to understand what I was feeling. I didn't know how to sort out my inner turmoil. I went to the kitchen and made a cup of coffee. I had the cup in my hands, but I didn't even think of drinking it. My eyes fell on some old photo albums on the table. Pictures of Adrian when he was a little boy, hugging me. How time had passed. The purity and innocence of those days. Now it all seemed like it belonged to a different life. I heard the door open and Adrian came home. He didn't look directly at me when he came in. It was as if the silence between us had become a wall between us. A wall we were afraid to even speak. "Welcome," I said, my voice barely audible. He just nodded. His eyes were lowered to the floor, but there was a restlessness in his movements. He went into the living room and sat in silence for a while. I couldn't stand it and went to him. "Adrian, last night? We have to understand what happened. It's not right for us," I said, my voice soft but trembling. I was afraid my words would break his heart, but there was no other way. Adrian looked up and his eyes met mine. There was something in those eyes. An intensity, a search still unresolved. Mom, I don't know either, but I can't suppress these feelings, he said. My heart squeezed for a moment. These words deepened the uneasiness inside me. The fact that Adrian didn't know how to deal with these complex emotions made me feel even more helpless. Adrian, sometimes the emotions we feel are out of our control, but that doesn't make them right. I always wanted the best for you as a mother, but this hurts us both, I said. A heavy silence fell over the room after my words. Adrian averted his eyes, but he didn't pull his hands away. I could feel the conflict on his face. Finally, he nodded slowly. You're right. It's just... I don't know. It's complicated, he murmured. It'll all work out in time, I told him in a reassuring tone. I was trying hard to hide the confusion and hurt inside me, but these words were meant to comfort not only him, but also myself. Adrian stood up. I need to go out for a while, he said in a low voice. I nodded without saying anything. I let him go, but as soon as the door closed behind him, a few tears fell from my eyes. My inner turmoil was not over, but we had made a start to fix things. Maybe it was necessary to distance ourselves for a while, to redefine our feelings. But when I retired to my room that night, I realized I was still thinking about Adrian's look.